Welcome to today's webinar on digital transformation, consumer identity and access management. I'm Katie Paspan with Pathmaker Group and will be the moderator today. We have 4 panelists today. Mukund Kaushik, Director of Digital at Southern California Edison, is our lead panelist. Vanita Bhushan is the President and Enterprise Architect at Ponus Research. Chris Fields is the Vice President, Security Strategy at Pathmaker Group. And Trace Guy is an Identity and Access Management Consultant for Secure IT. Vanita, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Katie. So welcome everyone, and let's just recap, right? We've done 4 sessions so far. We've actually done 3 so far. And what we've talked about is not just identity and access management. We've tried to bring to the fore identity and access management of the future. What are the things we need to think about as we think about IAM in the future? So we started with, the new normal, everybody's working from home. How does identity and access management policies, how do these get affected for companies? We've talked about artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the impact it has on identity governance. And then we talked about decentralized identities and the whole concept of bring your own identity, right? So this ties in really nicely with that, because what we're going to talk about today is consumer identity management, CIAM, and the role it plays in digital transformation. So to take a step back, digital transformation is, I think, something we all recognize, right? Companies are rethinking their whole consumer space for many reasons. I think the key ones being, if we think about them, consumers have changed. They have expectations. They expect to come in on any device that they have, maybe their phone, their iPad, their laptop, whatever it is. They expect to be supported as they try and access information from the various websites or applications. And they expect their information to be protected, because there's a whole lot of more awareness now, because you've got regulations, you've got standards, consumers can opt in, opt out if they want to share their information. And yet at the same time, there's the business that wants to leverage that information. And so from an IT and digital perspective, we have to change our ways of thinking. It's not just allowing them to log in and then access something. It's allowing them to log in, making them comfortable, and then allowing them to share information which can then be used by marketing or whoever your business is to target them with interesting notifications or whatever it might be. So there's the whole concept of security, branding protection, but it all boils down to what are your policies around consumer identity and access, and how does that tie in with this whole digital transformation process? So that's what we're going to talk about. And Katie talked to you about our guest panelist today. Mukund Kaushik has been doing this a long time. I think he and I did our first CIAM project together maybe 8 years ago, clean sheet of paper, brand new idea. And he's done it many times since then. The rest of the panel, we've all been helping customers in various CIAM projects around digital transformation. So we hope that, the wealth of experience we bring to this panel will help you be a little more aware of the things to think about and our recommendations based on our experience. So with that, I'll hand over to the panel, and I'll start it off with, I think my first question is going to be very basic, and it's to you, Trace. What exactly do you see as the difference between traditional identity and access management and consumer identity and access management? And how would you say that, companies need to understand that difference?
Thanks, Vanita. So yeah, I think from a philosophical perspective, it's very different. So obviously, the internals, the goals are very similar. Security, we want everybody to access the right content, things like that. But the value proposition is very different. So with workforce or internal IAM, the business has defined a role. They know who they need, and they know that they need to get those people their access quickly. So efficiency is kind of the name of the game. But then when you're talking about customer or consumer identity and access management, that shifts completely. Now it's not you're trying to necessarily get value out of the consumer, but the consumer wants to find how they're going to get value out of you. So it really turns it on its head a little bit. But then you get more into the substantial pieces, the implementation details. So the user lifecycle is totally different. Again, when you're talking about internal or workforce IAM, you generally know where your employees or vendors are coming from in some perspective. Even with mergers and acquisitions, it's still well-known sources of information. Whereas with users, you might implement a bring your own identity kind of setup, so that they may be coming from Google or Facebook, or they may do self-registration. And the data you're actually trying to capture and use is going to be different too. So again, looking at workforce, you're really trying to figure out how to get those users the right access at the right time. Make sure, segregation and duty policies are being enforced, things of that nature. But with the consumer, you really want to provide a personalized experience. So, you may have a work phone number for your internal folks, but you want the user's mobile number. So that way, when they call into an IVR, you already know who the user is. That's a great experience. And that's something that, it's kind of goes back to that twist where the value you're trying to provide isn't efficiency necessarily, but it's that really seamless experience. Which kind of lays into the next one, that the user experience is much more critical in a consumer space. Workforce and internal IAM, you have a captive audience, and they really don't get too many choices. So an occasional disruption or, a change in the UI, you can send out information, communications about it. You can be fairly certain that, your folks are reading it. It's not so in the consumer space. PwC actually did a survey back in 2018. Something like a third of users said one bad experience was all it would take for them to walk away from a brand they already liked. So that user experience, then you really have to get it right the first time once those users are on board. It's a little more forgiving on the internal side. And then scale, kind of like what you touched on earlier. They could be coming from all different places, mobile app, web, even IoT devices. So there's all sorts of different entry points. That also exposes more surface area for each of those individuals. So you kind of do have to be a little more concerned about the security. You can't rely on network security or VPN because these users could be coming from anywhere. Plus, just pure scale of the numbers. Typically more consumers, typically more data points that you're tracking about them. And finally, you've got the seasonality or the predictability of the usage. Some users, depending on what industry you're in, are going to log in first of the month all the time, or maybe they only log in once a year, or maybe it's only around tax season, or maybe you're a retailer and it's around the big holidays. So it's really hard to predict that. Whereas with workforce, you got the people right there. You can track the information. So Mukund, based on your experiences, what's a good roadmap for a company to look to digitally transform its consumer-facing applications and websites? How does CIAM and CRM fit in the big picture?
Thanks, Trace, and welcome everybody to the webinar. So as Vinita kind of set it up in the beginning, for me, coming into this digital transformation journey, I had the luxury and the experience of doing identity and access management implementations back in the day inside for the internal users. Started some of my roles in the digital transformation space, especially looking at the consumer audience. I had this basic background of identity and access management. And when I started to talk to the CMO, we started talking as to what are we trying to do from a marketing standpoint, from a digital transformation standpoint, especially when it comes to the consumer. You're trying to provide this one-to-one experience. You're trying to personalize the experience that when they come to your website or your mobile phone, etc. You want to deliver that one-to-one experience. But you can do that using a CRM platform. CRM platform can maybe capture and track all of the what you do on the website or the mobile phone. But how do you ensure that the person you're tracking is the person that you're tracking? And that comes from a very robust identity and access management capability. And that's where, for me, the way I look at digital transformation, identity and access management, especially for the consumers, what we're calling CIAM, is what I think is a foundational capability you need. Foundational because that's how exactly you identify who the user is in a very systematic and assured fashion, but then also creates the linkages with your CRM platform so that you can say this is who the user is and then what kind of services they have access to. And typically, if you look at any consumer, they go through a journey. Maybe initially they're just coming to your website to find out information about your service. You want to be able to provide them with personalized information. They come to your website. Maybe they sign up a user of your service, in which case typically the website that is a front door that provides information to them is not necessarily the same website or the same team providing the same website is providing personalized services. So all of a sudden, you are now connecting a number of discrete applications on the back end and providing a personalized experience to the end user, which is almost impossible if you don't have a good identity and access management platform underlying all of your consumer properties. And that's why from when I come into any kind of digital transformation, especially when it's about creating these personalized connections, the first thing I start talking about is, do we have a good, robust identity and access management platform that provides the level of that provides the identity and also the level of assurances that you need to provide to the consumer that the data is safe. Because the other element of this whole conversation in the consumer space is around privacy. So how do you make sure that not only are you protecting the identity of the users, but also making sure that anything that they do is also protected from a privacy standpoint. So there's a lot of linkages that I see a CIAM solution being an integral role to any kind of consumer-based digital transformation that you might be undertaking. So based on that, I think there's a lot of lessons learned that this panel can share. So maybe Chris, maybe you can share from your experiences what you have actually seen as some of the maybe common mistakes or some of the challenges that clients make as they're implementing their CIAM solutions.
Thanks, Mukund. Absolutely. So, Trace touched on in his initial topic, what some of the key differences are between consumer IAM and the traditional kind of workforce/enterprise IAM. So, when we talk about, okay, we're beginning that CIAM journey, and what some of the biggest challenges we've seen in making that transition. The first thing is really, a lot of times it's traditional IAM practitioners that are kind of working in conjunction with the business and the marketing organization. And so there really needs to be a change in context from enterprise users and kind of what they typically require versus the consumer. So number one, as Trace mentioned, we don't own the user and attributes on the consumer side like we do with enterprise. And so we really need to depend on the consumer to self-identify. And to do that, we really want attributes that are sticky and reliable. So, Trace mentioned the mobile number as an example. That's one of those that, tends to stick with the user over time, if they're coming in through different channels. If I can get that, I'm more able to recognize that, hey, this is a particular user. The challenge is, how do you capture that data and do it seamlessly? Because we're, on the consumer side, we're typically getting that consumer in a very early life cycle. They're more of a prospect than a traditional customer a lot of times, and so we really need to present that challenge, that request for that data in a way that's seamless, and maybe they're saying, oh, hey, I'd like to get more information about a particular product. Maybe that's the time to ask them for some of that data, as opposed to the minute they enter your site. So that's the first challenge, and again, there are definitely ways to accommodate that and do it in a way that we don't run the consumers off. The second area is integrating CIAM functions into our user experience and the user interface. And we need to be able to do that across desktop, desktop, laptop, tablets, and mobile devices. And, a lot of times that is from an infrastructure perspective, really make sure that those different, user interface types are as seamless as possible, and that we're actually integrating with the same back-end layers so we can present consistent information. So this is actually one of the major decision points around build versus buy for CIAM functionality. With enterprise, we're not as make or break on the user interface, whereas with consumer, we really want that user interface to be, seamless. And so if we've got a experience that our customers have grown to, to like and be familiar with, a lot of times it may be more about, how do I integrate some of these new consumer IAM functions versus, kind of rip and replace and have to fit within the lines of a solution to try to get the capabilities that we want. The third area is our user register and repository. So, again, from an enterprise perspective, we want to keep our consumers separate, and there's a lot of reasons for that we'll get into a little later in the discussion. But we want to have that registry be as close as possible to our, Makun mentioned our CRM solution, which is typically on the forefront of recognizing, hey, this is a new prospect. How do we convert that customer into, from a prospect into an actual buyer, and having, that registry and being able to capture those attributes and track them separately from our enterprise is key. The last big area is our infrastructure and services layer. So again, from a consumer standpoint, we are talking, again, typically it's more of an external infrastructure, but we still want that there's some, call them shared services layers from an IAM perspective that we still need to, provision the user, register the user. We need to make updates to their attributes. We need to, delete them when, on request. So there's a need to architect that integration between the consumer IAM services and our traditional workforce IAM services in a way that makes it easier on your IT operations personnel and supportability. It's one of the things we see with consumer. It's obviously it's typically seen as more of a 24/7 operation. So we want to have our support and operations personnel make their jobs as easy as we can when it comes to supporting the consumer. And then, lastly, I'll wrap up just on the biggest mistake I see, and that's, typically not thinking about our typical IAM governance use cases with consumers. So we still need to, think about that whole life cycle. A lot of companies, when they get a consumer, they think, okay, I've got them, I want to hang on to them for a lifetime. And it's not about necessarily deleting their data, but, recognizing that, hey, we haven't interacted with this consumer in, quite a while. So maybe we move that record into more of a, protected state. We can still recognize them when they come back, but as far as our day-to-day operational architecture and volumetrics, we can, segment those consumer records so that we don't allow them to impact performance and get things to a breaking point. So with that, Trace, kind of going back to, what's the difference in CIAM and, kind of how it relates to the business. How do you typically bridge the gap between what the business wants and what IT dictates?
Yep. So in all of identity and access, I would say this is the most challenging piece. So the first thing I always think of is, what is the request from the business? Do we really fully understand what they're trying to achieve? And if we are certain on those terms, then it's down to the risk identification, the risk management. What's going to happen if we don't put enough security controls around this? Can we quantify what the risk is if something happens? Because until you can start putting, even if they're kind of abstract, but until you can put dollar figures to the consequence of not doing it right, it's very hard to support your argument. So, it also starts to frame the conversation about what you can do about mitigating the risk versus just accepting it. So, if you say, would you rather have a breach that, on average, they cost you nearly $4 million in the US, or would you rather just spend $1 million on setting up additional infrastructure to get what you're asking for accomplished? That becomes more tangible versus just saying, oh, no, we can't do it. It's going to require XYZ system or XYZ tooling. On top of that, though, you also have to understand what regulations are going to apply to the data that you're collecting, and what capabilities you have in place today. So, maybe for workforce, it's not a concern, but for consumer, you've got the right to be forgotten, GDPR, the new one coming out of California. There's a lot more regulation. People are I think privacy is coming back into the focus, especially for consumers. It used to be the Wild West where anything kind of went, but enough people have been bitten by that they don't want that to happen anymore. And now, we've actually got consumers advocating for more privacy rights. So with all that said, depending on what the business is asking for, my approach would just say, what do we have available, and let's do a defense in depth strategy. So let's make sure whatever tooling we're going to set up, whether it's homegrown or off the shelf, let's make sure it's strong authentication. Whether that be conditional access or what have you, you have to make sure that's strong authentication that's actually going to be used. You also got to secure the data layer. So as you mentioned, Chris, separating, well, I think we've all mentioned it, separating the consumer and customer data from the internal workforce. You can separate it, and you can also set up some more security around it while the data is at rest. I mean, obviously, everyone's going to encrypt the sensitive data, everyone's going to protect it, but you can still layer things on top of that. And then you can actually start baselining the interaction. So what does a typical user interaction with your services look like? Does this look like a regular authentication, or can we identify a single IP that's just blasting all sorts of credentials at us? And that's another thing you have to consider is with customer IAM, you have a much larger attack surface. So, and I'm a consumer too. Sometimes I have bad passwords for websites I don't care too much about, and I've gotten alerts that, hey, we found your credentials on the dark web. So, there are adversaries out there that are collecting any and all kind of authentication credentials they can. And if your authentication API or whatever your authentication layer isn't strong enough to defend that, they're just going to be stuffing credentials in there until they find something that works. Same with your data or application API. So again, what's a normal transaction look like for those interactions? Do you know what normal looks like? And then do you get alerted when something's outside the norm? So those are different strategies you can take from an IT side to address even kind of the most outlandish business requests. So, obviously we're here to support the business and make sure the business goals are achieved, but we got to mitigate that risk. With all that said, though, technologies change, tooling changes. So I'd always say to the business organization, what are your policies? Where are they coming from? How are they organized? Is there a policy that addresses this need? So Mukund, from that perspective, what are some of the changes a company must make to its thinking and policies, especially around the security policies, to accommodate those CIAM requirements?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it's typically, if you look at the security policies that we use for our internal users, they have been prescribed by the security organization and socialized more in terms of awareness, versus when it comes to the consumer space, there are multiple stakeholders. There's the marketing officer who's a stakeholder in this conversation because he or she is responsible for driving acquisition and driving growth of the business. So it's not just about the security team coming up with the policies and saying, okay, these are the policies that we shall implement. I think it's a conversation that they need to have to make sure that the policies are also helping support the goals that the company has from consumer for marketing. At the same point in time, marketing also may have certain policies that may have to be reviewed so that we're not taking undue risk in terms of data that we're collecting about the consumer. Because to your point, we can collect a lot of data. And sometimes we don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot by collecting data that we may not have any use about. So it also becomes a conversation between the marketing and the security team to make sure that whatever data we are collecting is actually valuable for the company and has some use for it. Because if you collect it, then you got to store it, and if you're storing it, then you got to protect it. And then if and God forbid, if you have a big breach, then you have to declare what you have collected. So it's a very it's a collaborative process that requires conversations between the marketing organization, conversations with the security organization, and also if you have a privacy chief customer privacy officer, having a conversation with the privacy team to make sure that you're creating a set of policies that in the end make sure that the experience to the end user is not onerous. A very clear example would be the password length. So yes, typically internal users have no choice in terms of the password length and number of special characters that are required. But try and implement that for the consumer population. You will start to see potential drop-offs and that's not a good thing because the whole goal of the marketing campaign was to support and promote sign-ups. So you want to make sure that you're not making it so weak that your passwords are easily guessable, so to speak. But you also don't want to make it so stringent that the consumers are not able to figure out a good password for them to use. The other thing is choice. There's a lot of websites now that allow you to bring your own identity either through Facebook logins or Google logins, etc., Apple logins, etc. So there's also other mechanisms for you to maybe authenticate the consumer and make the sign-up process fairly simple. But at the end of the day, it's really a discussion. You can start with a set of policies that you have for internal users, but for the external users that you're trying to service, the policies and standards needs to be a more greater collaboration between the marketing organization, your privacy organization, and the IT security organization that exists within the enterprise. And this is all very challenging because it's easy to say we got to do this, but maybe Vinita, you can maybe share from your experiences on how you have simplified some of the policies that websites have to implement, but at the same point in time on a common foundation of a CIAM infrastructure.
Yeah, sure. So this is a favorite soapbox of mine. So pardon if I go into too much detail. Really, I think what we have to understand is web developers, app developers, people who are writing these bits and pieces that are supposed to enable CIAM and enable CRM, their focus is the business, right? They're trying to give the users a good experience. They want to make sure things look right, things work seamlessly. And then you throw in all these security requirements and you're talking to them about authentication and authorization and registration and all this cool stuff, which maybe as security consultants we find interesting. But for them, it's complex and they've got to understand technology. So what we've done in our experience and how we've approached this is really worked through web interfaces, APIs, that these developers can use for the services, right? So there are two things that come out of this. A, it simplifies what the developers have to do because they use an API, which you try and keep as simple as possible. Two, it abstracts the technology. So should something happen or should you need to change your policies, their API hasn't changed, the backend may have changed, so they continue to work, the applications continue to work. Because the other big problem we talked about is very often these applications are owned by the business, right? And if you come to them and say, I'm changing all the security stuff underneath, they're not going to give you, the priority of saying, okay, tomorrow we're going to change all our apps. They're going to have timelines, things are going to get delayed. So the idea that you have a consistent interface that people write to when they need to get some of these security services helps them because now they don't really care if you are changing the stuff in the middle where you see that access management layer in the picture, right? So the API kind of abstracts all the security hoopla that might be going on under the covers. Secondly, it gives users a consistent interface. Because if you think about it, if my login interface looks the same, whether I come in from my iPhone or from my web app or whatever it is, it makes the user feel like I'm going to this organization that has taken the time and effort to standardize things. How often have you gone? I mean, I know I have a credit card with a certain bank that probably you all know. But when I go to my mobile app, the login experience is extremely different to when I go to the web. And it always ticks me off to the point where I've even considered moving because it's just so painful, right? So consumers are looking for ease and standardization and consistency. So the API layer helps developers. It provides, sort of unified services from a security standpoint, and it also gives you a really good way to, have a consistent message when you're interfacing with your customers. And on that topic, Chris, I'm going to ask you this because I know you and I have talked about this in the past. When you have a customer come in and they, what do you tell them about specialized CIAM products as opposed to just taking what they currently have and extending it, etc.? What's your take on this, and what's the value of one over the other?
Okay. Yeah, this is really one of the critical decision points in starting the CIAM journey. And so we always ask organizations, start with what CIAM functionality are you targeting? Because there's a whole landscape, just as there is if you think about on the internal CIAM side or internal IAM side, and you don't necessarily have to bite, or eat the entire elephant with that first step. But it is important to look at, what is my, the vision we're targeting, and compare that with your current technical and functional capabilities. And so, with starting with that list, we can then say, okay, a package solution is typically going to cover everything from, network level, denial of service, geographical constraint type areas, and that's kind of more on the infrastructure side, to, your user registry, and actually provide the technology to, store your customer records and all the data we want to keep track of. It's going to provide, registration capabilities, how do we, onboard customers, have the ability to track preferences, what do they require as far as, language and, just kind of look and feel, as well as, just preferences around, your particular, application and industry. The privacy flows are going to be covered, with the package solution. How do I allow users to say what data I can and can't access with the different parts of the organization? The provisioning workflows, for how do I, actually create objects in all the right places, send signals to, downstream important services that need to be aware of the new customer and relationship. Tracking actually the contacts and, thinking about, customers, it's the whole life cycle. They initially start as a lead and a prospect. We need to, convert them at some point, and then, kind of expand our relationship with them. So that whole workflow, really thinking about it from a marketing standpoint, these packaged CIAM solutions will provide for you. So, if you really look at kind of that entire landscape of, what all do I really need to, am I trying to accomplish with my consumer IAM environment, we can then compare and say, hey, thinking about all the things I just talked about, is it, how does that compare to what you currently have? Because if you look at your, your current UI capabilities, your, geographical and global support with the infrastructure, if you can check a lot of those boxes off and say, what, we're really happy with the current, functionality we're providing in those layers. What we're missing is just that security integration and, being able to seamlessly embed identity in each of those flows. That's going to be an easier decision to say, yeah, we don't really, we just need to augment what we have versus, kind of totally start from scratch and look at a packaged product. So the second area is, let's say you made the decision that, okay,